They cut down every tree on Cane Mountain in the summer of 1917. The lumber company came in with cross-cut saws and mule teams, and they took it all. The oaks that had stood for 300 years, the chestnuts that had fed the valley since before anyone could remember, the tulip poplars so tall their crowns touched the clouds, the hemlocks and hickories and black walnuts and sugar maples, every single living tree on 2,000 acres of Appalachian mountainside, stripped to stumps and dragged to the railhead in Spruce Pine, North Carolina, and shipped north to build houses for people who would never see the mountain they'd killed. What was left looked like a battlefield, a hillside of raw stumps and torn earth and slash piles rotting in the rain. Within 2 years, the topsoil, soil that had taken 10,000 years to build, washed off the mountain in brown rivers that choked the creek below and silted the valley's wells and turned the bottomland fields to mud. Within 5 years, the stumps were gray and the hillside was a wasteland of briar and scrub and exposed rock that even the goats wouldn't touch. Within 10 years, everybody forgot that Cane Mountain had ever been anything but what it was now, a monument to what greed does to a place when it's finished with it. My grandfather, Asa Drummond, had owned 60 acres on the north face of Cane Mountain. Not the timber. The lumber company owned the timber rights, bought from the previous owner for a price that sounded generous until you understood what was being sold. Asa owned the land itself, which meant he owned what the lumber company left behind: 60 acres of stumps, eroded gullies, and broken ground at an elevation where the wind never stopped and the winters came early and the soil was too thin and too damaged to grow a fence post, let alone a crop. People in the valley called it Drummond's graveyard. Children dared each other to walk among the stumps at night. Adults used it as shorthand for foolishness. "That plan's about as useful as Drummond's graveyard," they'd say, meaning dead, gone, not coming back. When Asa died in 1940, he left it to me. His granddaughter, Ivy Drummond, age 14, currently residing at the McDowell County Home for Girls after the death of my mother from tuberculosis and the subsequent disappearance of my father into the coal mines of West Virginia, where men went in and sometimes didn't come out and sometimes came out, but weren't the same men anymore. The lawyer who handled the will told me the land was worth less than the paper the deed was printed on. The matron at the home, a woman named Mrs. Cagle, said it was the saddest inheritance she'd ever heard of, and the girls in the dormitory, who had already decided I was strange because I spent every free hour in the home's small garden, tending plants that nobody had asked me to tend, said I had inherited a graveyard and would probably end up buried in it. If you want to find out how I turned 60 acres of stumps into the most important forest in western North Carolina, and why the same people who laughed at Drummond's graveyard eventually came to me desperate for the one thing money can't buy fast enough, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I grew on that dead mountain changed not just the valley, but the way an entire region understood what a forest is for. I arrived at Cane Mountain on a cold morning in March of 1941. A mail carrier dropped me at the base of the old logging road with my bag and a paper sack lunch, and I climbed for an hour through scrub and briar, following a track that the forest had tried to reclaim and mostly succeeded. The higher I climbed, the worse it got. The stumps appeared first, gray, weathered, rotting, scattered across the slope like broken teeth. Then the gullies, raw channels carved into the hillside by 23 years of unimpeded runoff, some of them 3 feet deep, exposing red clay and bare rock beneath what had once been rich mountain soil. Then the emptiness, the absence of shade, of bird song, of the green cathedral that a forest creates overhead. just open sky and wind and the desolation of a mountain that had been used and abandoned. The cabin was at the 1,200-foot line, tucked against a rock outcrop on the north face. It was rougher than most cabins, built from lumber my grandfather had salvaged from the logging operation, with a tar paper roof and a stovepipe chimney and windows covered in oiled cloth because glass had been too expensive. But it was standing, and when I opened the door and stepped inside, I found something that the lawyer hadn't mentioned and the matron hadn't known about, and the laughing girls couldn't have imagined. My grandfather had been planting trees. The cabin's single room was half living space and half nursery. Along the south-facing wall, beneath the two windows where the most light entered, he had built a long, low shelf, a planting bench, and on it were wooden trays filled with soil. Dozens of trays, each one holding seedlings. Some were dead, dried out in the months since Asa's death, but many were alive, their roots holding stubbornly to the soil, their small green leaves reaching toward the oiled cloth light like prayers. Oak seedlings, chestnut seedlings, hickory, walnut, poplar, maple. I recognized them from the home's garden books and from my own obsessive study of the tree identification guide I'd found in the home's donation bin and read until the pages fell apart. My grandfather had been collecting seeds from surviving trees in the surrounding mountains, trees the lumber company had missed or hadn't bothered with, and germinating them in his cabin, nurturing them through their first fragile year of life before transplanting them onto the hillside. And he had been doing it for 20 years. I found his records in a tin box under the bed. Notebooks, 11 of them, spanning from 1920 to 1940. 20 years of careful documentation. Which seeds he'd collected, where he'd collected them, when he'd planted them, where he'd transplanted them, which had survived and which had died and why. Maps of the 60 acres with numbered plots, each one representing a section of hillside where he'd planted seedlings in rows and clusters, mimicking the patterns of natural forest growth. I put on my boots and walked the land, and there, among the stumps and briars, I found them. Trees. Young trees, 10, 15, 20 years old, scattered across the hillside in patches and groves, some barely taller than me, others already reaching 20 or 30 feet. They were thin and wind-beaten and growing in soil so poor that their roots clutched the rock like fingers, but they were alive. Oak and hickory and poplar and maple, growing in the exact locations marked on my grandfather's maps. Asa Drummond had spent 20 years replanting a forest by hand, one seedling at a time, one tray at a time, one season at a time, alone on a mountain that everyone else had given up on. He hadn't finished. The maps showed that he'd covered maybe 15 of the 60 acres. The other 45 were still stumps and scars and open ground losing soil with every rainstorm, but he'd started. He'd proven it could be done. And now, the work was mine. The first year was the hardest, because I had to learn everything at once. How to survive on a stripped mountain, how to nurture seedlings in a cabin nursery, and how to transplant them onto a hillside that was actively trying to wash itself into the valley below. Survival came first. The mountain offered less than the lush hollows and creek bottoms that other mountain people depended on. The north face of Cane Mountain was exposed, windy and dry. The topsoil was mostly gone, washed off in the 23 years since the logging, and what remained was thin, acidic, and hostile to anything that wasn't briar or scrub pine. My grandfather had dug a cistern that collected rainwater from the cabin roof, and a small seep spring about a quarter mile below the cabin provided water in all but the driest months. I planted a garden in the one relatively sheltered spot, behind the rock outcrop where the cabin blocked the worst wind, and grew enough potatoes, beans, and greens to keep myself alive. Barely. There were days I was so hungry my vision blurred. There were nights I lay on my grandfather's cot listening to the wind scour the bare mountain, and wondered whether this was the stupidest decision anyone had ever made. A 14-year-old girl trying to regrow a forest on a dead hillside with nothing but a dead man's seedlings and a stubbornness that felt, on the worst nights, less like strength and more like an inability to think of anything else to do. But every morning I got up and tended the seedlings. That was the non-negotiable. Before I ate, before I fetched water, before I did anything for myself, I checked the trays, watered them, turned them toward the light, removed any that had died, gently, the way you remove the dead from among the living, with respect for what they tried to be. The trees were what I got up for every morning. I followed Asa's methods, refined through 20 years of trial and error. He had learned that the key to reforesting a stripped mountain was not just planting trees, but rebuilding soil first. You couldn't put a seedling into bare, eroded ground and expect it to survive. You had to prepare. His technique was layered, patient, and brilliant. First, he planted what he called nurse crops, fast-growing plants that stabilized the soil and began rebuilding its organic content. Black locust, which grew fast and fixed nitrogen in the soil through bacteria in its roots. Autumn olive for the same reason. Native grasses, broom sedge and little bluestem, to hold the surface layer against rain. Clover, which carpeted the ground and fed the soil with nitrogen. These weren't the forest. They were the foundation the forest would grow in. Into this prepared ground, after 1 or 2 seasons of nurse crops, he planted the real trees, the oaks, the hickories, the walnuts, the poplars. He planted them in clusters, not rows, because natural forests don't grow in rows. He mixed species the way a natural forest does, oak beside hickory, poplar beside maple, because different species support each other through root networks and shared soil biology that monocultures can't replicate. And he mulched, obsessively, comprehensively, endlessly. Every dead branch, every fallen leaf, every scrap of organic matter he could find went onto the ground around his seedlings. Mulch held moisture. Mulch prevented erosion. Mulch decomposed into the dark, rich humus that mountain soil needed to support tree roots. My grandfather had spent 20 years hauling dead leaves and brush and compost up a mountain, handful by handful, building soil where the lumber company had destroyed it. I continued his work. Every day, every season. I collected seeds in autumn from the surviving trees in the valleys and ridges around Cane Mountain. I germinated them in the cabin nursery through winter. I transplanted them in spring. I mulched and watered and protected them through summer. And in between, I fought the erosion that was the mountain's constant enemy, building check dams from rock in the gullies to slow the runoff, planting willow stakes along the creek banks to hold the soil, terracing the steepest slopes with logs and brush to catch the dirt before it washed away. The first person to help was Moss Hensley. Moss was 61 years old, a retired logger, yes, a logger, who had worked for the very company that stripped Cane Mountain in 1917. He lived at the base of the mountain in a cabin he'd built from lumber he'd cut from these same slopes, and he carried the knowledge of what he'd helped destroy the way some men carry shrapnel, a weight inside him that never stopped hurting. His wife had left years ago. His children had gone to the cities. He lived alone with a dog and a silence that he filled with whittling. carving small animals from scraps of hardwood, the last remnants of the trees he'd felled. He found me in May of my first year, planting seedlings in a gully on the mountain's east face. He stood watching for a long time, his hands in his pockets, his face working through something I couldn't read. "Your granddaddy did this," he said. Not a question. "For 20 years. "I know. I watched him. Every spring he'd be up here with his little trees, digging holes, hauling mulch. Never said nothing to me. Never asked for help." Moss looked at the ground, the bare, eroded ground between the stumps. "I cut these trees, the big oaks, the chestnuts. I was 19 years old, and they paid me $2 a day, and I thought I was rich. We'd eat lunch sitting on stumps 4 feet across. Counted the rings on one once. 312 years. That tree was growing before the Pilgrims landed, and I cut it down for $2. He was quiet for a while. The wind moved across the bare hillside with nothing to slow it. Then he said, "I'm 61 years old and my back's bad and my knees are worse, but I can still dig a hole and put a tree in it." "That's all it takes," I said. Moss came every day after that. He was slow, but he was tireless, and he knew the mountain in a way I didn't, where the soil was deepest, where the water collected, where the wind was kindest. He knew which slopes had supported which species before the cutting, because he remembered. He had seen the original forest, had walked through it as a young man, had cut it down tree by tree, and remembered everyone. "There was a white oak here," he'd say, standing on a bare patch of hillside, pointing at nothing. "Biggest I ever saw. 4 men couldn't reach around it. Took us 3 days to bring it down." And then he'd kneel and dig a hole and plant a white oak seedling in the same spot, and he wouldn't say anything else for an hour. The forest grew. Slowly. Trees don't hurry for anyone, but it grew. By 1945, my grandfather's oldest plantings were 25 years old, some of them 30 feet tall, their canopies beginning to close and shade the ground beneath them. In those shaded areas, something magical was happening. The soil was coming back. Leaf litter accumulated. Decomposition built humus. Moisture held. Earthworms returned. Mushrooms appeared on rotting logs. The thin, gray, lifeless dirt that the lumber company had left behind was becoming soil again. Dark, rich, alive with the organisms that make a forest possible. And where the soil returned, new things grew without my planting them. Wildflowers appeared, trillium and bloodroot and jack-in-the-pulpit, from seeds that had lain dormant in the ground for decades, waiting for the shade and moisture that forest creates. Ferns unfurled in the moist hollows between my planted trees. Moss covered the rocks that had been bare and gray. Birds returned. Warblers, thrushes, woodpeckers, species that need forest to survive and had been absent from Cane Mountain for 20 years. The mountain was healing. Not because I had healed it, but because I had given it the conditions to heal itself. That was my grandfather's deepest insight, recorded in his 11th notebook in 1940, the last year of his life. "I am not regrowing the forest. I am removing the obstacles to the forest, regrowing itself. The mountain knows what it wants to be. My job is to help it remember." The valley's crisis began in 1947. It started with the floods. Spring rains, heavy but not unusual for the season, poured down the stripped side of Cane Mountain, the side I hadn't reached yet, and carried tons of loose soil into Cane Creek. Without tree roots to hold the earth, without leaf litter to absorb the rain, the water ran off the bare slopes like off a tin roof. Fast, brown, and destructive. The creek flooded. The bottomland farms that depended on the creek for irrigation were buried under a layer of mountain silt, infertile, rocky subsoil that killed crops and clogged wells. 3 families lost their spring planting entirely. A 4th lost a barn to the mudslide that followed. Then came the drought. Summer of 1947 was bone dry. The kind of summer where the sky goes white with heat, and the air crackles, and the ground opens in cracks wide enough to lose a boot in. And without the tree cover that had once held moisture on the mountain and released it slowly into the creeks and springs below, the water supply collapsed. Wells dropped. Springs that had been reliable for generations dried to a trickle, then to a stain on the rock, then to nothing. The creek that had flooded in April was a chain of stagnant pools by August, and by September it was dust. The connection was obvious to anyone willing to see it. The floods and the drought were the same problem. Both were caused by the same naked, treeless mountainside that couldn't hold water when it rained and couldn't release water when it didn't. The mountain's hydrology, the invisible system of absorption, storage, and slow release that a living forest maintains, had been destroyed when the trees were cut, and 30 years later, the valley was still paying the price. And on my 60 acres, the section I'd been replanting for 6 years, the section my grandfather had been replanting for 20 years before that, the springs still flowed. The soil still held moisture. The creek that ran off my land still had water in it, fed by the slow release of rainfall trapped by forest soil and tree roots, and the deep spongy layer of leaf litter and humus that a living forest maintains. People noticed. You can't not notice when your well is dry and your neighbor's creek is running. The first person to come was a farmer named Floyd Buckner, whose bottomland field had been buried by the spring flood. He stood at the edge of my planted forest, 12 acres of young trees, now thick enough that you couldn't see through them, and he stared at the ground, at the dark soil, at the ferns and wildflowers, at the green. "This was Stumps," he said. "I remember Stumps. It was. My grandfather planted the first trees in 1920. And the water? Your spring's still running. How?" "Trees hold water," I said. "Their roots hold soil. The soil holds rain. The rain feeds the springs. It's a system. Take away the trees, and the whole system collapses. Put them back, and it rebuilds." Floyd looked at me. "Can you teach me? Can you teach me to plant?" "Yes," I said. "That's what I've been waiting for someone to ask." That autumn, I started the nursery. Not a cabin nursery like my grandfather's, a real one. Moss and I cleared a 1/4-acre plot on the gentlest slope of my land, terraced it, built cold frames from salvaged lumber and old window glass, and planted it with 10,000 seedlings: oak, hickory, poplar, walnut, chestnut, maple, hemlock, white pine. Seeds I'd collected from every surviving old-growth tree I could find within 50 miles, climbing ridges and crossing hollows with a canvas bag, gathering acorns and nuts and winged seeds the way other people gather berries, with the urgency of someone who knows that every seed is a future. Floyd Buckner took the first 500 seedlings and planted them on his eroded hillside above the bottomland. I went with him the first day and showed him Asa's method. Nurse crops first, then the real trees, mulch everything, cluster, don't row. His wife brought sandwiches and coffee, and we worked until dark. And when we were done, Floyd stood at the edge of the fresh planting and looked at 500 seedlings that were each no bigger than a pencil, and he said, "This don't look like much." "It won't for 10 years, I said. "That's the part you have to trust." His neighbors took more seedlings. By the spring of 1948, I was supplying every farmer in the valley who had bare hillside and I charged nothing, not because I was generous, but because you can't charge for something the mountain needs to survive. That would be like charging someone for breathing. The county forester, a man named Hale Compton, came to see my operation in 1949. He was a quiet, serious man who had been trying for a decade to convince valley farmers to replant their stripped hillsides with almost no success. He walked through my grandfather's oldest plantings, now nearly 30 years old, a genuine young forest with closed canopy and understory growth. And he walked through my nursery with its rows of seedlings. And he sat on a stump at the edge of the clearing and put his head in his hands. "I've been writing reports about this for 10 years, he said. "Nobody reads them. Nobody listens. And here you are, a girl on a mountain, doing what I've been begging an entire county to do." "My grandfather started it," I said. "I just kept going." "That's the hardest part," Hale said. "The keeping going." Hale became my ally in everything that followed. He secured state funding for the nursery expansion. He connected me with the Civilian Conservation Corps reforestation programs, winding down by then but still active, and with the State Forestry Service, which began sending crews to help plant the remaining 45 acres of my land. He published my grandfather's methods in a forestry bulletin that was distributed across the southern Appalachians. I married in 1950. His name was Warren Cope, a soil scientist from Buncombe County who had come to Cane Mountain to study the recovery of stripped land and found something he hadn't expected: a 20-year-old woman who understood soil biology better than most of his university colleagues. Warren was tall and careful and had a way of looking at the ground that made you realize there was a universe down there you'd been walking over your whole life without seeing. We had 3 children on the mountain. They grew up in a forest that grew with them, gaining height and depth and complexity every year, filling in the gaps between my grandfather's original plantings and my own, becoming something that people who remembered the stumps could barely believe. Moss Hensley died in 1952 at 72. I buried him on the mountain, in a grove of white oaks he had planted himself. 5 trees, now 20 feet tall, growing in the exact spot where he had cut the biggest white oak he'd ever seen 35 years before. I carved his headstone from mountain stone, Moss Hensley. He cut them down. Then he put them back. By the 1960s, Cane Mountain was unrecognizable. 60 acres of Drummond land were fully forested, a young but thriving mixed hardwood forest that was already beginning to produce its own seeds, its own seedlings, its own next generation of trees without any help from me. The erosion had stopped. The springs had returned, not just mine, but springs all across the replanted sections, water emerging from hillsides that had been dry for decades as the restored forest rebuilt the mountain's capacity to hold and slowly release rainfall. The creek ran clear year-round for the first time since 1917. Birds, mammals, insects, the entire web of life that depends on forest, had come back as if they'd been waiting just off-stage for someone to rebuild the set. Wild turkeys appeared in the oak groves. Deer bedded in the thickets. A black bear was spotted on the north face in 1964, the first bear on Cane Mountain in 40 years. I wept when I heard. Not because I was sentimental about bears, but because a bear means the forest is real. A bear means there's enough food, enough cover, enough wildness for an animal that needs miles of unbroken forest to survive. A bear on Cane Mountain meant my grandfather's work had finally become something the mountain itself believed in, and the nursery had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. By 1965, we were producing 50,000 seedlings a year, supplied to farmers, landowners, and government reforestation projects across western North Carolina. The stripped hillsides of Cane Mountain, not just my 60 acres, but the whole devastated range, were slowly, steadily turning green again, one seedling at a time, planted by hands that had learned from my hands, that had learned from my grandfather's hands. In 1970, the state of North Carolina designated the Drummond Forest as a model reforestation site. In 1975, the U.S. Forest Service published a study using my grandfather's 20-year data as evidence for what they called community-based ecological restoration. In 1978, Warren and I wrote a book together, The Stump and the Seed, a family's 50-year fight to regrow a mountain, with Asa's name on the cover beside ours. Warren died in 1981, in autumn, under the canopy of a forest that hadn't existed when we met. I buried him beside moss in the white oak grove, where the trees were now 40 feet tall and the ground beneath them was carpeted with ferns. I kept planting. I was 70 by the time my knees said stop, and even then I planted from the porch, filling trays with soil, pressing seeds into the dark, watering them with the patience of someone who understands that a tree planted today is a gift to someone you'll never meet. I died in the spring of 1989 at 77, on the mountain, in the cabin my grandfather built. They found me on the planting bench with soil on my hands and a tray of oak seedlings in front of me, each one an inch tall, reaching for the window light. My daughter said I looked like I was tending something. My son said I looked like I was still growing. The forest stands. It is not old growth, that takes centuries. But it is real, and it is alive, and it is doing what forests do, holding soil, holding water, holding the mountain together against the gravity and weather that want to wash it to nothing. The nursery still operates, run by my granddaughter, producing 60,000 seedlings a year. The Drummond Forest now covers not 60, but 400 acres, as neighboring landowners planted trees from my stock on their own stripped hillsides. On the trail that leads from the valley to the cabin, at the spot where you first enter the forest and the light changes from open sky to green shade, and the air cools and the sound of wind in leaves replaces the silence of bare ground, there is a wooden sign. It reads, "This forest was planted by hand. Asa Drummond started in 1920. Ivy Drummond Cope continued, "The mountain did the rest." So let me ask you something. What's been stripped bare in your life? What mountain of confidence, of possibility, of hope has been cut to stumps by people who took what they wanted and left you with the wreckage? And what would happen if you decided today to plant one seedling? Not a whole forest. You can't plant a forest in a day, or a year, or even a decade. My grandfather worked 20 years and covered 15 acres. I worked 45 more years and covered the rest. A forest is not a project. It's a commitment that outlives you. But it starts with one seed, one hole in the ground, one act of faith that what you plant today will grow into something you can barely imagine. Shade and shelter and birdsong and clean water and deep soil and the kind of beauty that only patience can produce. They laughed at my stumps. They laughed because they saw what was missing. They couldn't see what was possible. That's always the difference between the people who laugh and the people who plant. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the stumps in your life and the seeds in your hands, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who replanted what the world had destroyed. Your mountain is waiting. The soil is thin, but it's there. Start planting.